Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Tasmania Island of Ideas online lecture series. Tonight, Living in a Changing Climate. First, let me acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land wherever you are joining this webinar. Here in Tasmania, in Hobart, that is the land of the Muhanina people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm Christine Milne. I'm a former Greens leader. I'm a climate activist for the past 30 years and passionate about the subject that we will be discussing this evening, how we live in a changing climate and how we respond to the urgency of the situation we find ourselves in. The Island of Ideas program is designed to keep ideas flowing, discussions happening all around Tasmania in particular, but Australia generally, in the light of COVID and the fact that we can't be live at the university campus as we would like to be. These webinars are a really important part of the University of Tasmania's outreach series into the community. Before we actually begin the formal part of the webinar, I'd like to just go through a few housekeeping measures. First of all, your microphone, camera, chat function and raised hand function have all been disabled so the speakers are not interrupted. But we do encourage you to ask questions, and that can be done anytime by typing your question into the Q&A box. And a selection of these questions will be put to the panelists after the three presentations. And finally, the lecture is being recorded for later access on YouTube and SoundCloud channels. Now, we are living in the changing climate. We are now this week at the beginning of Global Climate Change Week. All around the planet, there are more than 200 events from capital cities to rural areas to developed and developing countries. People are coming together to talk about what is to be done in the situation we now find ourselves in, because we are living in a global climate emergency and a global extinction crisis. Every week, you look at a television and you see extreme weather events, from horrendous flooding in the south of France to the fires in California to sea level rise and its impacts in Pacific Island countries. And what we are seeing is the fact that people who have done the least to contribute to global warming in terms of greenhouse gas emissions are the ones who are suffering the most. This is not just a climate issue. This is very much a justice and intergenerational issue, and that will be discussed this evening. But the one thing we can all agree on, it is well past time for incrementalism. It's well past time for just ad hoc responses. We need really systemic change. And so this evening, that's what we're going to hear. We're going to hear from a criminologist, from a human geographer and a physical geographer talking about those aspects of the system-wide change that we need. Our first speaker is Professor Rob White. He is the Distinguished Professor of Criminology at the University of Tasmania and co-author of The Extinction Curve. Rob has a particular interest in green criminology, pioneered the field internationally, and has written 7 books on the topic. He's a director of the Criminology Research Unit, academic director of the Centre for Applied Youth Research, and a member of the Tasmanian Sentencing Advisory Council. His research is focused on social and ecological justice, criminology, and youth studies. Welcome, Rob.
Hello, everyone. I think I'd like to start by saying that I'm drawing upon a book co-authored with John van der Velden. It's called The Extinction Curve. And the basic argument of the extinction curve is that in the midst of economic and climate emergency, the time now is for transformation. It's not time for tinkering around. It's not time for reform. It is time for a radical altering of the system as we know it today. And I want to just start with a couple of what I think are astonishing facts. One of them is this, that from 2016 to 2018, the total primary energy supply from coal increased by 2%, increased. And then astonishingly, over the last 3 years, global fossil fuel consumption subsidies have increased by 50%. So whilst we here in this Zoom room are describing a climate emergency, we have governments and states that are basically actively fomenting the very thing that we're trying to combat. So partly what I'll be discussing in my short time is, what do we do about this? We know from the science what the problem is. We know that we are moving very steadily and inexorably towards 1.5 and towards 2% global increase in temperatures that is going to radically change the nature of our climate in a particularly disastrous direction. We know that's what the science says. We also know from the scientists what needs to be done. We need to stop carbon emissions. That's the first step and the most fundamental thing that we need to do today, stop the carbon emissions. So the question is, why aren't we? And to understand that, we have to basically have an analysis of our very basic means of production and consumption. And that is organized today by a system of global capitalism. And global capitalism as a system is the thing that's ultimately destroying the environment through the exploitation of natural resources, through the exploitation of peoples, and through the degradation and destruction of the planet as we know it. What we've often heard, and literally in the last week or a couple of weeks, is a lot of people saying it's capitalism and there's a problem with capitalism. The Pope recently said capitalism has a lot to answer for. So the problem is that we use that rhetorically, but we don't do the analysis. And when we do the analysis, then we have to actually seriously move towards what would a post-capitalist society look like. And that's the work that my co-author John van der Velde and I have done in the book, The Extinction Curve. We said, okay, let's pull capitalism apart. Let's talk about the last 100 years in particular, the advent of global capitalism, the exploitation of labor, of nature, and so on. And once you do that, where do we go from here? Do we go a Green New Deal? Do we go green capitalism? Do we go technology? What do we do? And our answer is, well, no, we don't. What we need to do is transform the very system that is screwing up the planet. And that means that we have to move beyond capitalism. What we describe is the shift towards eco-socialism. We argue on the basis of 4 key things. The first thing is that we already exist. There's a precondition for that shift already, and that is we have a democratized system of production. That is, the systems of production are already socialized. It takes millions of people to produce and to put things together. We already collectively produce that. So we should put the decisions in our hands. And that's the second part of democratization, is that it should be in our hands, not in the hands of a couple of billionaires who basically make all the key decisions. So we need to grab democratization and see it as a precursor to even further democratization. We have to look at the limits to growth within capitalism itself. Basically, capitalism relies upon growth and in order to make profit. The limits to capitalist growth are there. It's not simply the limits posed by ecology, but the limits within capitalism itself. The impoverishment of its base means that people aren't consuming the products. We're inexorably leading to another economic crisis in the same vein that the coronavirus has led to the present economic crisis. A fourth precursor is that we have the concentration of capital worldwide. We have whole industries basically in the hands of a handful of people. Now, why that's a precursor to change is that it makes it easier to expropriate those industries off of those particular corporations and those particular individuals. If capital is concentrated, then we can take that, and we'll return to that point in a moment. We also have seen in recent times the fourth precursor, which is the centrality of the state. We've seen that especially during COVID, that the state has been absolutely essential. It's the thing that's kept us going here in Australia. We've seen the failures of the state in places like the United States and in the UK and so on. But basically where the state has intervened in a bold way, it has actually prevented lives being lost. The state can act in a way that's decisive. And it can also act in a way that's decisive in terms of economic power. Our argument basically in our book, The Extinction Curve, is this: prioritize social need, do things in the public interest, be primarily concerned with equity and equality, and importantly, what we need to do is wrest the levers of the economy out of the hands of private capital. In a nutshell, what we're calling for is democratic nationalization. Democratic nationalization. Put the power over the economy in the hands of the people, and we democratize the key levers such as health, energy, education, finance. These are the things that need to be nationalized. It has been done before, but not in a democratic way and not for democratic purposes. In the GFC crisis, a Scottish bank goes into crisis, the UK government bails them out, and didn't call it nationalization, just said call it bailing them out. 2 years later, handed it back to the private sector. We don't want to hand it back. We want to keep the banks in our hands. Remember, the Commonwealth Bank started off as the People's Bank. We want that bank to be our bank again. So at the end of the day, we've got to stop talking about capitalism in a rhetorical way. We need to analyze the mechanisms of capitalism. The key thing, though, is that we have to act quickly. There's an urgency here. We only have 10, 15 years before the most profound turning points. We don't have time to muck around. We need a strategy. What we provide is a framework for action. We know the problem. The problem of climate change is due to carbon emissions and so on. We know the genesis of the problem relates to growth and the growth imperative of a global capitalist system that depends upon growth for its profits. The solution must be to move to a post-capitalist society. We argue that the first step in that direction is democratic nationalization. Let's take control of our banks, of our health systems, of our education systems, and so on. Put it in public hands under public control. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that's interesting. And taking back our democracy, it's a great idea. It appeals to me greatly. It's easier said than done. We'll talk about that a bit later. I'd now like to move to Dr. Kate Booth. She's a senior lecturer in human geography with expertise in the capacities and failings of insurance in a changing climate. She aims to contribute to addressing climate catastrophe and associated socio-political challenges. Dr. Booth's research is motivated by an interest in place and places and the possibility of political dissent. She's particularly interested in the co-production of financial and economic processes and urban places and life. She currently leads research on the cultural, economic and social geographies of insurance in a changing climate. Kate also leads the university's postgraduate teaching program and coordinates the professionally accredited Master of Planning course. She teaches regional and urban planning. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Christine. I'll just clarify, I lead the Geography, Planning and Social Science postgrad program, not the university's program. I'm talking about how green choices are killing us in our consumption. So buying things, spending money makes the world go round, so we're told. As demonstrated during this pandemic, where the federal government continues to exert a huge amount of pressure on the states to end lockdowns, remove border restrictions and reopen schools, people must have freedom of movement. Specifically, people must have freedom of movement to shop, to spend money, and freedom to live busy and hectic lives that necessitate more spending in a high-speed attempt to meet daily essential needs, all with the aim of boosting economic growth. I don't remove myself from this equation. In fact, it's because I work full-time, I'm a parent of a school-aged child, that I know the pressures that pull me towards quick consumption and away from gardening, cooking and other activities that take me a little bit more time and a little bit more headspace. In this context, and in the context of living in a changing climate, insurance for me is an interesting consumable to think about, particularly house and contents insurance, that backup for property should disaster strike. In countries like Australia, research shows that most of us have house and contents insurance. It's a very normal and expected part of everyday life, and this is partly because of regulations around mortgage provision. It's so normalised, in fact, that there's a commonly held suspicion of those who don't have this form of insurance. And this speaks to the normative dimensions of consumption. Purchasing things is not something we simply do to meet basic needs or for enjoyment, perhaps. How and why we consume is part of the moral fabric of our society. In making decisions about what we consume, we surreptitiously enact social norms and patterns. Insurance, I think, is a good indicator of some of these broad social and political patterns and trends. So, to unpack some of these things, I'll begin this presentation with a potted history of insurance. And I'll chart 4 loose phases: its emergence as a financial product, its evolution in relation to the post-World War II welfare state, its role in neoliberalism, and the embeddedness of the insurance sector in the deep state. I will clarify what I mean by the term deep state a little while later, because I realise that can ring alarm bells for some people. But through this history, I will retain a focus on who is considered the bearer of risk and who is deemed responsible for what. I'll then conclude by linking the sense of security we seek for consuming insurance with the sense of security sought through green consumer choices, and how both are embedded within the economic growth paradigm and must contribute to climate crisis. The basis for my observations, just repeating the points that Rob and Christine have already made, is that we're now living irrevocably in a changing climate, and continued infinite growth on a finite planet is killing life as we know it, particularly for those already suffering various forms of disadvantage and exclusion. Globally, it is the richest 10% who are responsible for around 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's gross inequity there. So starting with the emergence of insurance as a financial product. Since the beginning, insurance has appeared a little controversial, and insurers have had to do a lot of work to sell the idea of insurance as well as the actual product. So the historical origins of property insurance, which I'll focus on in the main this evening, are a little obscure. So I'm going to start by looking at the types of insurance that cover risks of work, such as death, injury, sickness, and employment, as I think these provide a good indicator of the timing, motivation, and perception of insurance more generally. Work-related insurance emerged in response to the hardship and toil of 19th century workers and took on the appearance and function of social safety nets.
Kate, could you lean into the microphone a little bit more? We're having feedback from people that can't hear you very well.
Okay. Does that sound better, Christine? I apologise for that. Yet and unsurprisingly, devised by financiers, insurance was inevitably premised on profit and profitability. And it took a while for Labor advocates to come on board, because insurance, even if controlled by governments, undercut worker solidarity. It undercut the collective power of workers for improving work conditions and placed the solution in the hands of the individual. But insurance was eventually embraced for its social potential, partly because it looked a little like the redistribution of wealth. In paying a small amount of money, you recovered potentially huge and costly mishaps. In fact, to this day, insurance is described as embracing solidarity in that it creates shared interests through risk pooling that can then support individuals. Jumping forward, following World War II, the socialising potential of insurance was further embraced by governments in Western nations through the nationalisation of some forms of insurance, the most prominent example being universal healthcare. In this, the nation state was the bearer of risk and the holder of responsibility. protection was kind of taken away from individuals. Though it's important to note that not every kind of insurance was nationalised, and things like house and contents insurance, as we know, remain in the private sector. However, the growth in insurance uptake due to expanding middle classes and wealth meant that private risk pools, the number and extent of people signed up to insurance, contributed to increasing the solidaristic collective potential of insurance. Most people became insured for essentials through one means or another. Then around the 1970s came neoliberalism. A hallmark of this ideology, if that's what it is the privatisation or individualisation of risk and responsibility as part of a broader trend of dissolving social welfare nets, cutting government expenditure and enabling markets. Insurance still looks ideal in that, in theory, it allows individuals to take responsibility for their own risk by buying insurance and removes responsibility from the government. However, this is based on at least one flawed assumption, this being that all risk is scalable to the individual. And this is nonsensical, especially when you think about climate risk, a global phenomenon, and even more localised natural disasters like bushfires. These risks well exceed the individual and the individual's capacity to be responsible for themselves in relation to these. These risks are so huge, as we know, and so complex, they are beyond the ken and scope of the individual. And even if government rhetoric is still framed around individualised risk and responsibility, this is not how insurers are thinking about or approaching climate risk. Insurers remain focused on insurance as underpinned by a solidaristic or collective network of relations. And of course, they're still focused on profit and profitability. Which brings us to contemporary times and the deep state. A significant change in insurance for some people in some places is increasing insurance premiums. So I think the biggest rises in Australia have been in the cyclone-prone north, where there are examples of doubling or tripling or more of insurance premiums because of intensifying cyclone risks. When making these types of changes to premiums, insurers are on a tightrope, needing to both maintain a customer base and ensure profitability as climate risks intensify. So, as well as increasing premiums, insurers are scouring the planet for new sources of capital, of money. And by rapidly expanding global financial mechanisms and networks, insurers are currently able to maintain insurance for some wealthy Western populations in disaster-prone areas. Along the Florida coast in the US, for example, there's a mass concentration of population and wealth, and despite intensifying hurricane seasons and escalating losses, properties remain, at least for now, insured and protected. Insurance in this context is promoted by local governments as an ideal form of climate adaptation. And these governments, it's important to note, benefit financially from ongoing development enabled through ongoing insurability. Thus, this maintenance of insurability also acts to sustain and protect property markets, which then encourages more development in disaster-prone areas. From this, I'll make 3 observations. 1, the maintenance of insurance in these kinds of places provides a false and inevitably temporary form of security. 2, that there are multiple vested interests, both financial and governmental, in maintaining what amounts to a facade of life and business as usual. And 3, that's most importantly from the perspective of this evening, there's nothing individual about any of this. These types of insurance arrangements, the sustainability of these arrangements, are dependent upon networks and collectivities that spread globally as part of global finance. The key difference between this collectivity and those that existed during the emergence of insurance and then subsequently during the welfare state, is that the nature of these global financial networks is not common knowledge. Insurance may appear solidaristic in its redistribution of risk and capital, but it is a solidarity defined by a lack of accountability and transparency, sorry, I just lost my place. A lack of accountability and transparency, and it in no way carries obligations of equality and equity that democratic nations may aspire to. Considering that the insurance sector is one of the largest players in global finance, holds cutting-edge knowledge on climate risks, but remain largely unaccountable and opaque in their operations, they're also unelected, then this is why I use the term deep state. The power this sector wields is huge, is likely increasing, and remains by and large hidden. And this is all covered up, glossed over by government rhetoric around the individualisation of risk and responsibility that places insurance as central, as a central mechanism for climate adaptation. So before closing, I will link our attempt to buy security through insurance to how security, peace of mind, is being pursued through green consumer choices, organic veggies, solar panels, building green infrastructure, hemp underwear, the list can go on and on. Purchasing these things can help us feel like we're doing something right. They can give an impression, a sense of a secure future. Now, buying green is not necessarily a problem in and of itself. I think the problem emerges if consuming and shopping is the primary response to climate catastrophe. Simply because green choices act to support and strengthen the economic growth paradigm, the shop till you drop paradigm, the problem of living well beyond our means on a finite planet remains, it festers and is ultimately destroying life as we know it. As I hope I've illustrated through insurance, consumption decisions are heavily invested, whether we like it or not, in a global financial system, and ultimately it is this that must change, not simply what we buy. It is the global economic system and how it is supported and acted locally and nationally that must change if we are to hold on to some semblance of equity and livability in a changing climate. Green consumption is growth in green clothing. So I recognise that this is a big ask, asking that a big, amorphous and powerful entity like the global economy change. So there are three things I'd like to put forward. Firstly, that we start imagining a future without insurance. Specifically, we start imagining a future where house and contents insurance does not exist, and not just a catastrophic future. Humans have lived without insurance for millennium. They still do in many parts of the world. So we can start imagining a future that is equitable and livable based on forms of security and sustainability that are not dependent on global finance. Because a world without this kind of insurance is a world that has undergone radical system change. Second, we need to take action. 4 weeks ago, we saw 27 climate activists arrested in Hobart. Next time, let's make it 270, and the time after that, 2,700, and then 270,000 arrests. As the founder of Extinction Rebellion in Tasmania, Tristan Sykes, says, we need to cause as much disruption as COVID-19 for governments to take action on climate change, as we have seen exactly how quickly governments will move and can move when pushed. And third, lastly but not least, a slightly easier thing to tackle, there is a petition circulating asking the University of Tasmania to declare a climate emergency. We have over 500 signatures so far, we need more. UTAS is a leader in climate research and on some sustainability issues, that it could and should do more. So if the petition hasn't landed in your inbox or come through your social media feeds, please search Declare Climate Emergency UTAS and you should be able to find it, or email me directly. And my email address is on my UTAS profile page. So to finish up with a take-home message, we may be able to shop our way out of the COVID-19 crisis, at least in the short term, but there is no way in hell we can consume our way out of climate change. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. There absolutely is no way we can consume our way out of climate change. And I love the fact that that petition is circulating to call on the university to declare a climate emergency. It absolutely is consistent with a lot of the teaching courses that are going on at the university, but it's absolutely imperative in the time that we are living, that we move to recognise there is no time left. We actually have to engage in systemic change, which is the point that you're all making. I'd now like to move and introduce to you Dr. Vishnu Prahalad. He's a lecturer in physical geography with expertise in ecology, environmental management, systems thinking, and political economy. Vishnu has varied research interests ranging from salt marsh and wetland ecology, science communication, community engagement, planning and management, systems thinking, moral philosophy, and political economy. His research and teaching focuses on supporting varied organisations and community groups through engagement, capacity building, and incentives in order to foster sustainable systems of production and consumption. Over to you, Vishnu.
Thank you, Christine. I'm going to share my screen in a second. I've got a presentation that I'll run through. Oh, there it is. So can you see my screen and can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
Yep, thank you. So I'm going to talk today about climate extinction and the reinvention of daily life. And I'm going to do this more of a personal story, and that's because we've had two great speakers just before, and also Christine herself has done a lot of work in this area, and particularly referred to her 2012 press club speech, which covered a lot of the subject that we are talking about today. So, this goes back in time, if only we had listened more closely. So my personal journey, just over the last 10, 12 years since I've been in Hobart, Tasmania, is looking at ecology. I've been involved in conservation, looking at wetlands. So over the last 10 years, I've documented climate change and extinction. And this happens all around us. With climate change, we are losing some of the longest lived species in coastal salt marsh anywhere in the world, and also the biggest species, which is Decoupling abuscula here. At the same time, we are also continuing to approve building developments in these coastal wetlands, despite all that we know about their ecosystem services and so on, as we've seen in Port Sorrel recently, but also right across the state. And this is coming after me moving from India, where I have lived a completely different life, where daily life is completely different to what it is now since I've been acculturalized in Tasmania, in Hobart. Just in the last 10 years, I've taken a lot of people out in the field, exploring salt marshes and so on. And I've had an interesting insight from that experience that most people, when they spend time in the wetlands, they intuitively understand the value of these systems. And that really questioned my work in terms of, if I go around documenting the values of these systems and publishing it, will people read it? Or is the problem something different, that we don't have the time to have meaningful experiences in these wetland ecosystems? So this has been a personal journey of learning. And through this process, invariably, you come across politics, as both of our previous speakers have indicated, and I had my own journey through politics. With Professor Paul Boone, we reviewed what's happened to wetlands, and there is neoliberalism right there involved in all of this. And in this journey, I've also been inspired by the work of David Harvey, which just to a great extent structures my talk as well. So I want to start here by recognizing that as an ecologist, I'm deeply aware that we live in a systems age. Ecology is systems science. The systems age has been recognized by various people over the decades. I'll make reference to Russell Ackoff, Professor Emeritus from Wharton Business School here, who basically used this metaphor to differentiate the age before the systems age, which was the machine age that came out of Enlightenment. With Cartesian dualism, we take things apart, we look at the world as a mechanism. And since the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we've transitioned, at least within the scientific community, to look at the world differently with a different lens, which is the world as an organism, cooperation replacing command and control. And when I say we, I'm talking about the hegemonic culture here, not necessarily the Aboriginal culture and indigenous cultures around the world. And indeed, my own culture coming from India, Advaita Vedanta, and some of the Eastern traditions, which innately have this systemic understanding or deeply ecological understanding of the world. So you can see this understanding has really helped us to develop a language and also look at data within the context of the climate debate. If you look at Earth systems science, which has been since the 1960s and 1970s, this was a recent publication by Stefan and colleagues, where they chart the history of Earth systems science. And you can see that it started with James Lovelock's Gaia and the beautiful image of the Earth from outside in space, looking at this fragile object as a small system within part of a bigger system and so on. And at this time, we also had a global metric, which we use regularly. It's done every day. The most recent reading is 411 parts per million, while we should be below 350 or indeed 300 parts per million. And also more recently, that's evolved into a broader conceptualization and understanding of the world we live in and the limits that we have. And now to thinking that we are at a precipice into moving towards a hothouse Earth. And I mention this because it's important to recognize the contributions of systems thinking in understanding the world we live in and the language that we have in talking about climate change. So this is an interesting snapshot of the world we live in. If you just wanted to have a look at one picture of it, and it's making a lot of rounds around the world. Kate Raworth's Donut Economics. It's interesting because not only does it capture the ecological context where climate change is obviously an issue, but like I said, biodiversity is more of an issue. It's just that we don't tend to talk as much about that in relation to climate change. But also, despite overshooting these limits, we're not doing very well in terms of social foundations as well. And another way of thinking about this is the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are lagging behind a lot of these goals, despite United Nations pushing for decade after decade since the 1950s and 60s and so on. But this is perhaps not as helpful. What I want to do is put this into this context, which is, I think, more helpful in this conversation. Yes, we have grown our GDP over the last century and so on. If you look at the data, it's been 2.25% per annum, and the target now is 3% per annum. This is business as usual. The best we are given, as both the previous speakers indicated, is green growth. That growth is important, it is necessary. What we will do is grow more sustainably. And in doing that, we have a lesser resource implications. So we bridge this gap between the growth of the economy and the supporting system that basically subsumes the economy as such. But if you look at the literature, if you look at any kind of studies, comparing gas is often used as an alternative, currently politically, that is used as an alternative as a cleaner resource, or indeed renewables. And this is my problem with renewables, is that they are important, but they can't be a blunt instrument. And they are used as a blunt instrument now in the context of green growth. If you look at car independence, that's the same thing. We are tied to our roads because that's what we have built up all around us. And even lifestyle reductions. And, we had Craig Rykossel at ABC with, Planet A documentary. By the end of that, we just figured out that if everyone changed their lifestyle, we're only going to reduce 15% of Australia's emissions. And that's been the study around the world as well. The green growth argument is simply not working. So there's a different argument, which is degrowth. And I want to tease that out a bit more. But even degrowth perhaps might not be enough. What we need is sufficient absolute decoupling, and that is to come within the donut, as Rawat says. And I'm passionate about this because this is not a theoretical idea for me. There are people involved here, and I've met some of these people, and I feel a great sense of obligation to these people, and indeed the species that I study, which are right here in Hobart and Tasmania. So that's my goal, and different people might have different goals in the spectrum, and it's not for me to tell what people's goals should be. This is my argument. This is what I want to dedicate my work towards in terms of looking at sufficient absolute decoupling. So how do we get to sufficient absolute decoupling? And here I really like this saying that a great proportion of the solution is a more careful or indeed systemic definition of the problem. So let's take a look at this diagram here, which is the iceberg model. What we tend to see is events, a bushfire happening here, a renewable energy project being approved there. And then, often the best we do is go into patterns. But underlying those patterns are systemic structures, and capitalism is very much part of it. Our worldviews, like I said, the machine metaphor or the organism metaphor are our worldviews that drive the systems that we create and produce the patterns and behavior we tend to see, right? So these are the social structures, things like rules, institutions, information flows. Now there's an increased focus on media ownership. All of that is part of this design, right? So this determines what we see, what kind of an environment we live in, the world that we interact is all determined by these system structures and models, to the extent that in the context of behavioral economics, which is microeconomics, the idea of consumer sovereignty has been killed. It's dead. Consumers are not sovereign, as has been argued previously. In fact, all of our choices that we think we make ourselves individually are driven by these systemic structures. When I leave my house, I don't have a choice of using public transport or cycles, because all I've got is a highway, and I am wedded to my car. And that goes back to the previous Mattioli paper on car dependence. That is that there is no neutral architecture. Any way a choice is presented will influence how the decision maker chooses, right? So it's a very important context to understand that these system structures and mental models are what we should be looking at and examining. So if you look at this from the economic perspective, and this is the work of Herman Daly and since been embellished by Donald Meadows, a leading systems thinker, it's a beautiful metaphor that for life on Earth, and people are part of life, for us to flourish, we need to focus on our ultimate ends, what makes us happy, feel secure, and so on. And to do that, we consume, right? So invariably we consume, and consumption leads to production, and that needs to be extracted from the natural environment. So what's happened here is that our focus has been myopic in terms of looking at just production and consumption, to the extent that we forgot about what the purpose of all of this is about. And this is about human well-being. Well, let's have a look at how people are going, if that's the purpose. Gallup polling, which is a leading polling agency, this data is well verified, it's been done all over the world. What it's saying year on year is that 85% of the global population is not happy with their work. Imagine this, you go on across a counter, you exchange money to get a commodity, and the person who's across the counter doesn't like their work. This is a really depressing view of the world, and this is what we have produced out of a myopic view of production and consumption. David Graeber since talked about the bullshit jobs, developed the theory further. And you can also think about it, why we call it compensation, right? Compensation is because, we consider work as a disutility we have to put up with for most of the week so that we get compensated for a loss of our time and so on. And even within the broader economic system, we moved away from the goal of full employment, which we had under the Keynesian era. Under neoliberalism, it's moved towards a focus on inflation and growth, and we've lost the ideal of full employment. So this has created alienation and solastalgia. Alienation is essentially we feel alienated from our labor because the fruits of our labor are dispersed. Often we don't have access to them. We feel alienated from our families because we're not spending enough time with them. We feel alienated from our neighbors, from the earth around us, from the nature around us, right? But also solastalgia, because solastalgia is a loss of our connection with the natural environment around us, and that's especially for people who have been tuned into that, or growing up. That's a stronger feeling. And David Attenborough's recent documentary, if you haven't seen it, Life on Our Planet Earth, is a classic example of David experiencing solastalgia through his life, and a powerful emotive documentary. So what has conventional economics given us? And even if you look at how we measure national well-being, and we hear this in the media every day, is gross domestic product. And the clue here is in the P, the product. We're not even measuring consumption, let alone welfare. So this measure is deeply flawed, and yet we are using this as the compass for our economic system. And in doing that, of course, nature is considered as an externality, because it's machine age, remember, not the systems age or the organism age. And we still, moving towards a system age, but this conceptualization comes from the machine age. And consumer sovereignty is assumed, although, as I mentioned, it's been heavily debunked within behavioral economics. And also think about producers. Where are the producers? They're in Bangladesh knitting these shirts in sweat factories. Farmers who are committing suicide in India at the rate of knots, and so on. So we've forgotten about production. We've removed that out. We've cleansed our environment out of these productive enterprises. So what that brings us is that, in terms of system design, we've been told the last 40 years, there is no alternative. This is the end of history, essentially free market neoliberalism, so that you can't even raise this for conversation. If you raise this for conversation, it's out of bounds. You're branded as some crazy person, and so on and so forth. But in this last 40 years, we've had alternatives. We've had Schumacher's Buddhist economics. We've had Herman Daly's steady state economics, which is still a very fertile field for people who wanted to have a look. And more recently, what's more hopeful is that we have a new macroeconomics of modern monetary theory. And modern monetary theory then can justify a Green New Deal or full employment and so on. So we've got these tools. It's just that we need to change the conversation and move forward. And in changing the conversation, I have an important observation to make here, in the sense that if we look at the history of evolution of capitalism, when we had the post-war Keynesianism, and when that transitioned to neoliberalism, it didn't happen because people wanted action on climate, or indeed people wanted protecting nature. It happened because of what Hayek called road to serfdom, Friedman's capitalism and freedom, or indeed Fukuyama's The End of History, the final form of human government. It was an all-encompassing value system that captured the imagination of influential leaders like Thatcher and Reagan, and that then filtered into policy and practice and to the air we breathe today, right? So that happened because it was about something fundamental about life itself, not about an issue that most people can't relate to immediately. And that's I think an important point to make. To then move on to the last point I wanted to make, which is obviously the focus of all of this, is the reinvention of daily life. And when I talk about daily life, I obviously draw from Marx and also Guy Debord, Perlman, David Harvey, David Graeber, George Monbiot, and Rob Hopkins. So there are lots of examples of this around the world. Relocalization is an example, and buying local, retrofitting our suburbs and being prosumers in terms of, putting on solar panels on the roofs. So there's lots of different examples. But one I want to focus on here is the idea of retro-suburbia. It comes from our very own David Holmgren, who spent a lot of time in Tasmania before obviously moving on to the mainland. It's a remarkable resource that we have, is almost a guide for us for how we plan and think about our daily lives, right? So the most important investment we make is a house, but still we use it as a lodge, right? So we spend most of our time outside at work. If we do spend time at home, we glue to the television. But isn't that odd? Why can't we make our home as a more nourishing environment? And in surveys that we did recently, asking people, what's stopping them from growing their own food? Most people want to grow their own food, but they're limited in terms of their time and other resources. So we can resolve this by retrofitting our suburbs so that we can reimagine how we live our daily lives. And we have tools for this. You know, what's happening with collaborative consumption, Jeremy Rifkin's zero marginal cost society, where we are being both prosumers and also consumers, where the production loop happens close, and you have lots of feedbacks, and feedbacks improve system function. And more recently, Sam Alexander's work on degrowth in the suburbs. And indeed, I'll finish off by saying that UTAS is already doing this across their curricula, Diploma of Sustainable Living, and a lot of the work that we do in geography with Kate and indeed with other colleagues. Within our courses, we look at how we can do it one system by a system at a time. Obviously, all of this need to be upscaled, and we need to resolve things about ownership and global financial flows and so on. But we can start now. It's already happening. We can go and chip in and contribute to these initiatives and scale up. And in doing that, reimagine and retrofit our daily lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vishnu. There's an awful lot to consider out of those three presentations, and particularly that reinventing our life, our daily life. And one thing I will come to with all of the panelists as you think about your various topics is whether the lockdown and disruption that COVID has brought to the planet and to us locally has actually given people a bit of an insight into what disruption can do and the good things that people have got from it, of course, notwithstanding the horrors of the illness itself. But the relocalisation has been something that people comment on a lot. So I'd be quite interested as we go through the various topics to talk about that. But I'd like to now go to a series of questions. We have a few that have started to come in, but if people have got others, please put them in the Q&A box. One of the questions I'll refer to now, I might direct particularly to you, Rob, and that is a question that has come in relating to your issue about why aren't we bringing down emissions as quickly as we should, and what would a post-capitalist world look like? And the question is, how can you say that ending capitalism and nationalisation and renationalisation is the key to reducing fossil fuel consumption when China, which has done just that, is the #1 fossil fuel user in the world? So over to you, Rob.
Fossil fuel production is not the key issue in the end. The key issue ultimately is growth based on profit. Because regardless of when we finally make that transition away from fossil fuels, we still have that inevitable difficulty posed by the fact that we keep consuming and production is based on the profit motive. So we're actually consuming a lot of crap, basically, a lot of stuff that we actually don't need. And then if you look at it in a global context, most or a goodly proportion of the planet is not consuming sufficient to meet their basic needs. And so the argument basically is this, that we need to prioritize and focus on social need that includes things like the basics: food, health, education, welfare, the arts. And so that's what makes life worth living. And that's what we need to focus on. But to get to that point, we actually have to capture the commanding heights of the economy, because ultimately we can do a bit at home, we can do some recycling, we can rejuvenate our suburbs, but that's a drop in the ocean in terms of what ultimately needs to be done, which is to wrest the decision-making, that is the power, out of the hands of the billionaires who basically are controlling the key decisions of our planet. So I think that that's ultimately what we need to do. The thing about China is that it's simultaneously one of the worst offenders when it comes to the polluting the planet, but it's simultaneously one of the key innovators in terms of new technologies. And that's because the framework fundamentally is a capitalist and profit-making framework within an authoritarian state. And what we're actually moving towards is authoritarian capitalism. And China's the model. And Trump would love to have the Chinese model. He'd love to be pally with Bolsonaro in Brazil He'd love to keep talking to Boris and basically deny as many fundamental rights and democratic inputs as possible. Authoritarian capitalism is unfortunately the alternative pathway to what I've been describing. What I've been describing is democratic nationalization. That is, the people take control over the resources and we redistribute and we make the decisions collectively. The alternative is ultra-right nationalist authoritarian state capitalism.
Exactly, and that's where I wanted to take you up on this, because after having a decade in the Senate, I came out saying that Australia is no longer a democracy, we are a plutocracy, and that essentially money buys politics in Australia, and we've seen it time and time again. And most recently, the COVID recovery task force is full of the fossil fuel sector. And even to the point of unelected people advising that committee who've come straight out of the oil and gas sector. So there's a lot of issues about how do we get our democracy back? And one of the fundamentals of that is how do you get dirty money out of politics or dark money out of politics? So in your book, in terms of eco-socialism, is there much emphasis on corruption, donations, reform, ending the revolving door between business and politics, for example?
I think that fundamentally that's where it leads. So what we are putting out as a framework for action, the first key step, we would argue, is democratic nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy, put the energy sector in our hands, put the banks and the finance sector in our hands, and so on. But then we need economists, we need ecologists, we need skilled people to work on the policies, to work on the anti-corruption movements and so on. We need, basically, there's a lot of fine detail that must go. But going back to something that Vishnu said, we have to start with the values. And the values have to include the analysis of power and sectoral interests. And if we don't start with that and overthrow those very interests, then we have no say. We are fundamentally, in this Zoom room, we have no say in our futures at the moment. And the only way to gain a say is to build coalitions of people at the grassroots. And we need to combine, we need to join, we need to be active, but basically the movement's got to come from the ground up, because it surely ain't gonna come from the top. And it's not gonna come from the mainstream conservative political parties either.
Thanks, Rob. Well, that's a good point to bring you in, Kate, to get coalitions of people who are basically out there campaigning. Would you like to just talk a little bit, in your presentation, you talked about essentially corporate finance sector influence through insurance, and this is something I've been interested in for a long time. We see it with after extreme weather events, fires and cyclones and the like, and we've seen it here in Tasmania with erosion from sea level rise and storm surge, and people thinking their insurance policy, because it says flooding, actually cover them for storm surge, and then find that actually they're not insured for that. We're also seeing local government still irresponsibly approving development in flood zones, etc., relying on the private sector insurance, if you like, of somebody to respond to that. And ultimately, we're going to see people having no option when they can't get insurance but to sue local government for having allowed them to build in vulnerable locations. And that's one of the fallout from the fires as well, where local government is now saying you can't rebuild in a lot of these areas, and that's because you can't get insurance. So Kate, you're advocating to, if you like, go into a future without insurance. How do you explain that to people who are increasingly worried about extreme weather events in Australia and the impact on their personal property, as well as the community, of course?
Yeah, okay, I'm hoping you can hear me
Yes,
now. Great, because I apologise before people couldn't hear me. So I guess just to clarify, I'm not advocating directly that people do without insurance. That's a big call to make on people's sense of well-being and security into the future, but definitely a change in how we do insurance, that it shouldn't be dependent on global finances, which it currently is, because one reason for that is that being dependent on an insurance that is networked in within global financial, the global financial sector is actually deeply insecure in and of itself. So we're dependent on a whole range of networks and power at play that we have no capacity to influence. There's very little tangible there that we can influence in terms of ensuring that, you know, if we have insurance, we're going to have insurance for years, decades to come. I guess if we don't address climate change, then we will inevitably live in a future without the kind of insurance that we recognise today. But I think it's really useful to imagine a future without insurance. There are people, we've interviewed people as part of our research in southeast Tasmania that live voluntarily without insurance. They tend to have small homes. They tend to be able to imagine a new house out of a few items from the tip shop, for example, or salvaged things. They live very simple lives, often on low incomes. So there are ways of living in contemporary society without insurance, but I would caution against advocating for tearing up your insurance policy at the moment if you live in a disaster-prone area. So I live in a bushfire-prone area. I have insurance. So yes, not telling other people not to have it wouldn't be very nice of me. But yes, thinking a little bit more about insurance when you purchase it and the vulnerabilities that opens up. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything will be okay, either because you've missed a clause in your insurance contract, or potentially I've heard stories from bushfire-prone Victoria where people have had insurance, they've lost a house, they've rebuilt, and then they've rung up insurance company to ask to insure their new house, and they've been told no, we won't reinsure because of the fire danger. So I think it's a useful mind game, I guess, at the moment to start thinking about a future with different forms of insurance.
Yes, and there are all sorts of political conundrums. For example, I know years and years ago, more than 15 years ago, New South Wales government had a coastal and estuarine map showing the vulnerability of coastal real estate to storm surge and sea level rise. They buried it because they knew that if they came out and actually made that public, then it would drop the value of some of the most expensive real estate in New South Wales, and the property developers and vested interests would have been singularly unimpressed. So they just buried it. And what we're seeing is a lot of responsibility shifting. Instead of governments and local governments calling it in terms of changing planning schemes and thinking in the public interest, they are de facto letting the insurance industry make those decisions by refusing insurance rather than making proactive decisions themselves. Kate, there's another question here in terms, and as a social geographer in Tasmania, I'd be interested to know, there's a question here saying, do we think it'll be easier or more difficult to achieve transformational change in Tasmania and our society here? Now, it is interesting because we're a relatively small population. We're an island state. COVID has shown us that we are quite capable of managing our society when we've essentially had to pull up the ladder jack. So what is your thinking about whether we can achieve or be a bit of a, if you like, a lighthouse to the world by showing what transformational change can happen here in Tasmania?
Okay, just before I answer that, Christine, I'll just add a couple more things about insurance briefly. So I've seen firsthand as part of a process involving the state government in Tasmania, the power of the insurance sector of coming in and throwing their weight around within a consultative process, and the possibility that that contributed to sinking some risk knowledge being distributed to the public in Tasmania and information about the details of insurance, and what works and what doesn't. So it's really important that that sector is called to account in some way Also, the insurance sector is very, very keen to see us ourselves as private individuals doing mitigation and adaptive work in terms of our homes, and in governments doing larger scale mitigation activities, all coming from the public purse. So that needs to be addressed too. So in terms of Tasmania being a beacon of hope for the future, I have mixed feelings about this. Obviously, we have a rich history in Tasmania of standing up for what matters, particularly from an environmental point of view, but we are a very small island on a big planet, and the risks we're experiencing are global in nature. So whether Tasmania's smaller community has some capacity to act decisively, it reminds me of a story or a perspective that Pete Hay gave. Pete Hay is a well-known former academic in the University of Tasmania, political philosopher and a poet, and he's Tasmanian through and through. And if my memory serves me correctly, he talked about the fact that Tasmania potentially has the capacity to go back to a system of government similar to that during Governor Arthur, where the power and resources are held out of Hobart, and then there's lots of people living up in the back blocks making do in a sustainable way within small communities, and by and large keeping away from the power, potentially brutal power base in Hobart. So that's one imaginary for a future of Tasmania. But I think there's benefit in Tasmania being more global in its outlook. At the moment, a lot of activism within Tasmania is very locally focused. The environmental discourse in Tasmania is very locally focused. There's huge capacity, I think, for Tasmania, the environmental movement, to expand its thinking in relation to some of the ideas that inhabit and occasionally inhibit what change is required within the Tasmanian context. So I'm not giving a black and white answer there, Christine. I'm sorry. I would love Tasmania to be a beacon of hope. It's my home, but I also recognise the complex interconnections globally that make that a challenge.
Absolutely, and having, as I'm a fifth generation Tasmanian, but very much with a global outlook, so I do think all the time, and I must say with the current debate about exporting all our renewable energy, instead of thinking about the systemic change that Tasmania could make using our own resources to electrify transport, agriculture and all the rest, does concern me. But Vishnu, I wanted to move to you, and this goes to something, I just said something that you said about renewable energy, when you said that renewable energy has become a blunt instrument. Now, I particularly was pleased to hear you talking about the biodiversity emergency we live in as well, and I totally agree with you that the focus has been on renewable energy as a response to global warming, and the whole issue of biodiversity conservation abandoned, or largely abandoned or ignored, and in fact people saying they're prepared to sacrifice biodiversity in order to roll out large-scale corporate renewable projects, and that does bother me. Vishnu, what did you mean by renewables are blunt instruments?
Well, I think in the conversation with renewables, we don't really tend to focus on what we're currently using the energy for, and whether this is again going back to the need to look at it systemically, and this is the systems age. We need to look at it systemically. So for one example, there's lots of examples. One example, if you look at Tasmania, we talk about needing to expand renewable energy, but if you look at the energy consumption, households only use something like 20% of the energy, right? So we have the big companies like the zinc works use huge amounts of energy, and there is the chance that the company might shut its doors, and if it does, then we have excess electricity just coming out of the zinc works not actually being there. So I think we need to look at it more systemically. And another example is this happened when the carbon tax came on board, and a lot of people complained about the carbon tax raising electricity. One of the group of people that complained was the frozen foods industry. And this industry was involved in exporting food out of season, holding it in freezers and selling it. And I think that was an opportunity for us to actually ask, is this the kind of industry that we want in this century? And we never asked the question. You know, we gave them the answers they wanted to hear, saying, oh, don't worry, we'll go back to business as usual. You'll get your power bills back and so on. So we have an obligation, I think, to transition those people who find themselves at the rough end of this transition we all need to make. That how can we meaningfully as a community support these people? And this is where, you know, instruments like job guarantee would help people seamlessly transition from institutions or businesses that are, you know, not going to help us in this century. But we don't have that, and hence we have this ongoing political issue. And this is going to happen in Queensland, right? So in Northern Queensland, again, we don't have that program such as a job guarantee where people can go, and if they lose work, and have that feeling like, you know, this is for community. We need to look at what we want in the future, not so much where we've come from and the sunk dependence that we have. So my key focus here is that we should have a broader discussion of what energy is used for, how much energy are we planning to use, what kind of economy are we going to have. And if we're having that discussion, you know, I'm happy to be involved in that. But if the argument is that, yes, we need more renewables because renewables are the way of the future, then I think that doesn't really do it justice.
I couldn't agree more. I have to say, I'm thrilled to hear you say that.
Yeah.
But I'm going to now throw you one of the questions that's come in, and I think it's very pertinent to all of you. So you might all want to respond to this. But Vishnu, I'll go to you first because you've stressed degrowth and decoupling as something that we need to really focus on, and I would agree with you. But this question says, higher education has been presented as an engine for continued economic growth, and many undergraduate courses still promote economic growth as the central goal, and the contribution that students will make to society is basically as part of that economic growth paradigm. How do you reconcile the views you've presented and this implicit and explicit messaging that is being presented to students at the university and, in fact, in the marketing to overseas students? I won't leave it just with you. I'm going to come to the others as well.
No, do you want me to go first, Rob and Kate?
No, you go first.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
And then I'll let the others answer too.
Yeah, I can tell you what I'm doing, Christine, and I'm clear about my values, but also the way I present my values. I'm respectful of students' own values. So this is why I think of it as a spectrum. So when I had that decoupling spectrum, you know, there will be students for whatever reasons, you know, students who are coming from economically impoverished backgrounds. It's very hard for them to think big. So for them, it's perfectly reasonable for them to look at renewables and look at the lower end of the spectrum. But especially for students who have the capacity, and I consider myself lucky, you know, being born to, you know, parents who were able to send me off, you know, to do studies here and so on. So people who have the capacity, understand the issues, these are students, they need to aim big, and they can aim big. They can go and look for opportunities that make a positive contribution. And I'm happy to say a number of our students have taken that up and gone on to do just those things. And I think the choice is there with the students. And what I tend to do is give them those options and then leave it to them so they can make those choices. But also, like I mentioned with the choice architecture, the broader environment has to change, and that the university has a role through research and engagement and outreach like what we're doing here to help change that environment, and petitions like what Kate's doing. And that then helps students when they go out so they can connect both those things together. So yeah, I think it is changing, and this talk is an illustration of that.
That's great. Thank you, Rob. We'll move to you to comment on that, and just in that issue of how do you get consistency across all your departments in the university so that university branding around climate and emissions reduction and changed value systems becomes something the whole value system of the university. So Rob, over to you.
Okay, I think it's happening in two ways. Firstly, all the lecturers who are lecturing in the business schools are also people. I know it's hard to imagine, but yes, they're people too. And they live in communities and they have neighbors and they have children and they have parents and so on. They're not immune from all the things that's happening around them. And we do have, for example, environmental accounting. We have a whole range of specialisms within the business schools that deal with these issues. So I think that we shouldn't see them as separate, but they're part of the debate. They're part of the general debate over values and economics in our society. And I wouldn't necessarily immediately stereotype business schools as being about growth and capitalist profit, because there's a lot of critical political economy that can also occur within the context of business schools and accounting and so on. But the other thing, and I think this is to answer it in a possibly a more positive way, look at what we at the University of Tasmania are doing within our own business, because we are leading by example. And I'm a member, fortunately, of the Sustainability Committee. And because of that, I've learned about what we're doing within the university. Now, we have, from the Chief Operating Officer downwards, we have a whole bunch of people looking at sustainability and looking at how do we change our economic models, how do we change our procurement policies. We've just announced that we're divesting from fossil fuels investments, so we're changing investments and so on. So I think hopefully that can feed back into what we teach the students, so that we're leading by example, but we're also learning. We're learning about positive screening and negative screening investment. So we want to negatively screen up the fossil fuel stuff. We want to positively invest in industries that aren't going to stuff up the environment. It may not be biofuels because that affects biodiversity and GMOs and so on, but it might be something else a bit more productive. But the university itself and its own economic engagements is a really good exemplar of what we can do in the here and now in a much more progressive and ecologically beneficial manner.
Thanks, Rob. I would note there Corey Peterson's work in that sustainability in the university has been absolutely pioneering, and it's been a long, hard slog, but it's fantastic to see the changes that have been made in the university. But at the end of the day, it is still the small contribution of a single university. It is the systems thinking or systemic change in terms of what the university offers and stands for that becomes the bigger picture. Kate, what's your response to this?
So the university internally is as diverse as society in general. So I have the fortune of teaching or leading the planning program, the postgraduate planning program at the university. Now I say fortunately because planning has a rich history in social and environmental equity and equality. So its history is steeped in the idea of lifting people out of the squalor of the cities that resulted from the Industrial Revolution. So it's inherently just at its roots. However, the Master of Planning that I coordinate is also industry accredited. So it's a job ready course, looks ideal from some people's point of view in the current push towards making universities more aligned with producing work ready students. So we get two cohorts of students, roughly. One is interested in using planning to make the world better through development. So the status quo, one cohort of students. The other cohort of students has a more, I guess, progressive view and is hoping to make the world better through things like environmental planning, to incorporating social justice and environmental justice into workplaces and decision making around planning and development. So as staff, and Vishnu is one of the staff in the planning program, we have an opportunity to speak to both cohorts. And one of the things that's recently happened is I've changed a unit, which used to look a little bit like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic in terms of planning priorities, in terms of, you know, moving this here, and that's how you get a beautiful looking region, and is now completely reworked to focus on climate change and many of the issues that we have discussed this evening. So the university is an incredibly diverse place. All kinds of things are happening And as climate awareness percolates up through the community, it percolates up through the university. And I've witnessed a massive change in interest around the impetus of taking action on climate change since last year.
Right. Well, that's very, very pleasing to hear, because we don't have a moment to lose. I just wanted to go quickly, Rob, back to you. There's a question here about, is there an example? There are a couple of questions actually that came to where in the world can we look to with an example of eco-socialism, for example, or at least some tendencies in that regard, or other places where there's a sign of hope, because as we have said before, with Putin and Boris and Trump and so on, there's a lot of authoritarianism going on. Where can we look for something that's going in the other direction?
I think the signs of hope lie within the student movements, through Extinction Rebellion, through the 350.org, all these kinds of organizations. And what we need is a coalition and collaboration of people from the grassroots. We need to push back, but the pushback has to be driven by the reality of the contradictions of capitalism itself. I'd mentioned China before. Why is China significant? Because it's directly plugged into the global capitalist system. It's the exemplar of what authoritarian capitalism can do. And what we want to do is come up with counter examples to that, which is fundamentally about grassroots action and democratic activity. The hope that we offer in our particular work is a framework of analysis that says the antecedents of something new are here today. Now, if you look at the history of social transition, often the antecedents weren't there. So we had the Soviet Union emerge out of a feudal society. It was a backward society in many different ways, and you had the distortion and Stalinization of the political relations, and you had, in essence, an authoritarian, totalitarian society emerge. What we have today is real opportunity to build upon the democratic antecedents, to build upon the contradictions of capitalism itself and the concentrations of capital. So the time is here. The other thing we have, and this is perhaps a hopeful sign, is that COVID has taught us that things can change quickly. And it has taught us that if we stand up and if we care about each other and protect each other, and we go against those vested interests, we can actually have a better society. So I think that it comes back again to that question of values and politics, but always acknowledging that this is not an argument. This is a fight. This is a struggle, and it's going to hurt. But if we don't engage in that fight and that struggle, then we lose, and we lose everything.
Well, absolutely right. And we have 2 minutes left. So Kate and Vishnu, I'm just going to go to you for a 1 minute answer in relation to this. You've talked about, Kate, you've talked about protest movement, and several of you have referred to Extinction Rebellion, 350.org and the climate groups. What about citizens' assemblies? What do you think about that as a way of proceeding, of increasing democratisation of decision making?
So I think citizens' assemblies are a great idea. They bring in more voices of the public into democratic decision making, and we urgently need to reform and boost our democratic processes and institutions at the current time. One concern I have is, and reflecting what Rob just said, we are in a dire situation. I wouldn't agree that we've got 10 years to turn things around. We need to do it now. And the best way that I can see of that happening now is for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people on the street, like the picture behind me here. I think Greta said we need to panic. Rob said we need to fight. So get frightened, because this is frightening, and act now. Don't sit around waiting for governments to come up with a plan in 10, 20, 30 years. So citizens' assemblies might be too slow. We need to be on the streets, millions of us.
Absolutely, and it is, I would agree with you about the 10 years. I think we're already beyond the tipping points in several of the ecosystems we are considering, and that means radical change now. And so, Vishnu, over to you. The UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration starts next year, 2021 to 2030. Do you think this is an opportunity for the reset on bringing biodiversity back into a serious discussion about nature-based solutions to global warming? Obviously, renewable energy is there, but what about nature-based solutions? Is this a hopeful opportunity?
Absolutely, Christine. I think it is also relates to one of the questions asked, where in the graph I talked about sufficient absolute decoupling, and that's the urgency that we need. And to have sufficient absolute decoupling, we need to take carbon back from the atmosphere and return biodiversity and rewild our open areas, which have been lost historically. So to do that, I think we need to reimagine our production system. If we can be prosumers, if we can retrofit our suburban environment, have a use value revolution, which I had more time to talk about that, where we immediately, who's got the capacity to think about how do we ensure we have use values in our communities. So community becomes insurance, community becomes part of resilience, and production becomes part of our daily life. And then we can release those areas. We don't have to grow food in these wild areas. We can return them back to wilderness, and then we'll have wild catch too as a consequence. So that is definitely part of the solution.
Thanks, Vishnu, and get active, everyone, and sign the petition. The university must declare a climate emergency. That would be a good start. Well, we've run out of time, so I would like to thank you all for joining us this evening for this discussion, and I'm sure you'd like to join me in thanking our presenters, Professor Rob White, Dr. Kate Booth, and Dr. Vishnu Prahalad for their contributions. And I'd like to remind you that this evening's talks will be available soon as a video and podcast via the Island of Ideas website that is now on your screens. And the series continues with the upcoming online public lectures and forums also on the screen. And I'd like to encourage you to continue the discussion by registering for these talks. The University of Tasmania is looking forward to continuing the ideas, debate and discussion in, for and around the future in Tasmania. So thank you again for taking part, and please get active, because we have to stop emissions, additional emissions going to atmosphere right now. Thank you very much.